I want to start with a different religion, a different person, and the day on which this person fled King's Chapel for his life. I'm talking about Henry Caine. Some of you may know him as the last minister of King's Chapel before the Revolutionary War, when this place was still an Anglican institution. Henry Caine was indeed an Anglican, but of greater consequence for him, he was also a loyalist. I don't need to tell you that 1776 was a bad year to be a loyalist in Boston. By that time, thousands of loyalists had fled the 13 colonies and dispersed throughout the British Empire, to Canada, the West Indies, and even back to London. Caine stayed at King's Chapel for as long as he could, but he knew in his mind that if the rebels, as he called them, took the city, he and his fellow parishioners, his loyalist Anglicans, would all be put to the sword. Well, we know what happened. The rebels did finally seize the city. And when this happened, Caine made good on his word, and he fled. He gathered up all the church artifacts and personal belongings he could carry, and he too made his way into exile. That day was March 10th, 1776. The British Army would finish evacuating the city of Boston just 1 week later. Caine's destination and the place where he would live the remainder of his life was Nova Scotia, Canada. Why am I talking about Henry Caine at a lecture about James Freeman? Well, the story of James Freeman and the origins of American Unitarianism begins with Caine's exile. For the duration of the Revolutionary War, the congregants of King's Chapel who supported the war and stayed in Boston were without a minister. These former Anglicans now called themselves Episcopalians. I want to take a second quickly to explain these two terms, Episcopalian and Anglican. Episcopalian simply refers to a certain kind of church governed by bishops. The Anglican Church is an example of an Episcopal church. What makes it Anglican is the fact that it is also controlled by the British state. So here's a simple equation going forward. Episcopalian, for our purposes today, is just Anglicanism minus the British state. So after the Revolution, when Parliament lost control of the colonies, Anglicans who stayed behind in America simply became Episcopalian. Caine's exile left the congregation without a leader for 7 years. This all changed in 1783 with the arrival of a 24-year-old kid from Charlestown, James Freeman. Freeman is one of my favorite characters in American history. We'll talk a lot about him and his place in history, but for now, a quick overview. Freeman was born in 1759 to Congregationalist parents. As a boy, he studied at the Boston Latin School, and at 14, he entered Harvard. Freeman read widely as an undergraduate. He began with a typical course in Greek, Latin, and logic. In his later years, he made a foray into the religious and scientific texts of the English Enlightenment, into the works of Locke, Paley, Newton, and a lesser-known Anglican minister named Samuel Clarke. Clarke was an Anglican, but what makes him interesting to us is that he was also an anti-Trinitarian. Anti-Trinitarians are Christians who do not believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, the idea that God is three equal beings in one, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. This notion struck Clarke as bizarre and counterintuitive. So in true English Enlightenment fashion, Clarke decided to test the soundness of this doctrine by putting it through a rigorous logical analysis. In an epic work, Clarke reduced the Bible into a set of 1,251 propositions. He would use these propositions to show that the doctrine of the Trinity was riddled with logical inconsistencies and contradictions. By the way, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Toward the end of his life, Clarke would embark on another ambitious project, a revision of the Anglican liturgy that excluded the doctrine of the Trinity. But Clarke died in 1729 leaving behind an unfinished manuscript copy. Fortunately for Clarke, he was not the only anti-Trinitarian in the Church of England. In a small parish in North Yorkshire, a young Anglican minister named Theophilus Lindsay was having the same misgivings about the Trinity. Lindsay was beloved by his small parish, but he was now uncertain whether he could serve them faithfully. It was one passage from St. Paul, "There is but one God, the Father," that drove Lindsay to despair. How could this statement be consistent with a Trinitarian conception of God? Lindsay was so distraught he almost quit the Anglican ministry altogether. But this all changed one day in 1771 when Lindsay learned of a petition that gave him some hope. There was a movement afoot among about 250 other dissenting ministers to petition Parliament to ask for more religious freedom. Specifically, freedom from swearing oaths that made reference to the doctrine of the Trinity. Lindsay quickly became a leader of this movement, circulating the petition tirelessly throughout the country. In 1772, the men went before Parliament and beseeched the legislature to restore their natural right to interpret scriptures for themselves. They made it clear they were not separatists, but rather Anglican reformers who wished to remain part of a more tolerant Church of England. But Parliament would have none of it. You see, Parliament was in a tricky situation. On the one hand, this legislative body was responsible for creating England's civil law. But because there was no separation between church and state, the Anglican Church was the official state church of England. Parliament also had the duty of creating ecclesiastical law. In the end, Parliament rejected the petition because they worried that granting such a degree of religious freedom would undermine the civil order. Sir Roger Newdigate, the chief opponent of the petition, summed it up nicely. He said, "Civil and religious establishments are so linked and incorporated together," these are his words, "they are, quote, as inseparably connected as the soul and body. If religious establishments were to fall, quote, civil establishments cannot stand." So Lindsay's petition was called the Feathers Tavern Petition for the pub in which it was drawn up. It failed. But in failing, it at least clarified for Lindsay and the dissenters what the impediment to Anglican reform was. It was Parliament, the national legislature, which in England was also the ecclesiastical legislature. Parliament's dual prerogative to write civil and religious law made it harder to pass religious reforms. Parliament not only had to be wary of the repercussions within the church, they also had to think about the impact of those reforms beyond the church. At this point, Lindsay's only option was separatism. With generous moral and financial support from his friends, Lindsay bought up an old auction house on Essex Street in London. The Essex Street Chapel would become the first Unitarian chapel in England. Lindsay would also obtain a copy of Samuel Clarke's unfinished anti-Trinitarian liturgy. Lindsay would finish it, and this would become the first Unitarian prayer book in England. Yet it's interesting. When you read the preface to this new Unitarian liturgy, you see that Lindsay was still thinking about Anglican reform. He says that he hopes his revised prayer book would, quote, conduce to the Reformation so long wanted and now so loudly called for in the national church. Well, this call for Anglican reform did not stop at the water's edge. Across the Atlantic Ocean in Boston, Massachusetts, a young man named James Freeman would hear its call. So here we are, back in Boston now with James Freeman. The year is 1783. Freeman had already graduated from college, and he would have gone straight to the ministry had the Revolutionary War not gotten in the way. Now that the war is over, Freeman is basically an unemployed college graduate again. One day the phone rings. It didn't. A letter was delivered from Thomas Bulfinch, a warden at King's Chapel. It was a job offer. Come to King's Chapel, Bulfinch said. We know you're not an ordained minister, and we know you're not even Episcopalian. But you're a smart guy, and you can fill in as a lay reader until we find someone permanent. Freeman takes the job. So why would this son of Congregationalists accept a job at an Episcopal church? There are two reasons, I think. The first reason is pretty simple. In his own words, Freeman tells us he liked the Book of Common Prayer. Easy enough. And second, Freeman also said that he had, quote, no design to adopt all their, Episcopalians' tenets. For example, Freeman considered the idea of uninterrupted apostolic succession. We'll come back to this, but it's the idea that all bishops in the Episcopal Church are descended from one another in an unbroken line dating back to the apostles. Well, he considered this idea to be absurd. He even believed that in America, these are his words, bishops would be a pernicious order of men. Useless, he believed, in an egalitarian and meritocratic country like the United States. Freeman, in fact, says he preferred the independent form of ecclesiastical government practiced by the Congregationalists. So from the outset, Freeman had a reformer's mentality. He was not like other Episcopalians. He was ready to do something different. As Freeman said in a letter to his father, this was the age, and America the country, of innovations. The part of the Episcopal faith Freeman was most eager to reform was the Trinitarian part. Freeman did not believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. So this makes him, like Samuel Clarke, like Theophilus Lindsey, an anti-Trinitarian. Freeman wasted no time making that clear. The same year he arrived at King's Chapel, he delivered a series of lectures expounding on his anti-Trinitarian philosophy. At the same time, Freeman worried that these lectures might have been too radical for his congregation. He later confided to his biographer that he was under a strong impression that these lectures would be the last he should ever pronounce from the pulpit of King's Chapel. But the congregation, liberal in its sentiments, listened. And just a year later, Freeman felt he had their permission to undertake his first major reform, an anti-Trinitarian revision of the King's Chapel liturgy. You notice a pattern here. All these anti-Trinitarians reform the liturgy. Drawing heavily upon Lindsey's own Unitarian prayer book, Freeman struck out references to the doctrine of the Trinity. And as a side note, it's just fascinating. When I was doing my thesis research, I was lucky enough to be able to see Freeman's original copy, his Book of Common Prayer, at King's Chapel. And you can see him in his own handwriting, writing in the margins, putting brackets around Trinitarian sections, and then writing omit right next to it. So you see him mapping this all out. So what gave this 25-year-old divinity student the liberty to undertake such a significant reform? Well, we know that Freeman had the consent of his congregation. Freeman tells us that only 15 out of the nearly 90 families at King's Chapel raised any objections to the Reformation as he called it. But there was also something much larger at work that gave Freeman license to do this, and it was the American Revolution. Freeman believed that the American Revolution was more than just a political revolution. It was not just the forced transfer of political authority from the British Parliament to the American Congress. It went beyond that. It was also a religious revolution, one that separated irrevocably American Episcopalians from the Church of England. Yet other Americans disagreed with this interpretation. American Episcopalians knew that a political revolution had taken place. By this time, even the most traditional ministers had removed references to the king, to Parliament, and to the royal family from their worship ceremonies. But they disagreed that a religious revolution had taken place. In their opinion, it was entirely possible to remain loyal to the religious authorities in the Church of England, not to Parliament, but to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so, at the same time that Freeman was up in Boston, independently revising the Episcopal Liturgy, a group of American Episcopalians was convening in Philadelphia with a very different agenda. They were gathered to discuss the future of the Episcopal Church in America. And their first order of business was to write to the Archbishop of Canterbury to express their desire to remain loyal to him and to the Church of England. So the seeds of conflict were now thoroughly sown at two levels. First, there was the religious disagreement about the doctrine of the Trinity. Freeman was an anti-Trinitarian, and the more mainstream American Episcopalians were not. Simple enough. This was the same dispute that both Clark and Lindsay had been engaged in back in England. Only now something was different. The American Revolution had introduced a second dimension into this religious debate. The question now was whether independent American citizens were free from the orthodoxy of the English Church, as Freeman himself believed they were. Or did the power of the Archbishop somehow survive the revolution? In either case, the dispute between Freeman and American Episcopalians was no longer just about the doctrine of the Trinity. Now it was also about defining the limits of American citizenship. This dispute came to a head in 1786 when Freeman sought episcopal ordination. Although Freeman's congregation was no doubt heterodox in their views, they did have great respect for the Episcopal tradition. They wanted a fully ordained minister, and they even wanted their minister to be ordained in the apostolic line. And to his credit, Freeman was willing to oblige out of respect for his congregation. He didn't like bishops, we've seen this, and he thought that apostolic succession was silly at best. But the issue did not weigh on his conscience the way the doctrine of the Trinity did. So Freeman went along with it. But apostolic succession was hard to come by in the early Republic. Here's why. The Archbishop of Canterbury was responsible for ordaining new clergy in the apostolic line. But under the current laws of the Church of England, all candidates to the ministry were required to swear oaths of political allegiance to the British king. So for the time being, no new American clergy could be properly ordained without essentially committing treason against the United States. This was a real bind, but Freeman thought he could get around it. The answer was Bishop Samuel Seabury. This part gets complicated, so bear with me. Seabury was a very conservative Connecticut Anglican. Well, Episcopalian at this point. But his own ordination had been anything but traditional. When Seabury traveled to London to be ordained right after the war, Parliament turned him away. The war, they said, had just made things too complicated for the Archbishop to begin suddenly ordaining new American bishops. So the enterprising Seabury then traveled to Scotland, where he was ordained by Scottish Presbyterians. These Presbyterians were descended directly from Anglicans. They broke from the English Church when James II was deposed during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But because they remained loyal to James II, they never swore any political oaths to the new monarchs, William and Mary. This was perfect. The Scottish Presbyterians were very similar to Episcopalians. They were also definitely part of the apostolic line, but with none of the political baggage. So from them, Seabury obtained his apostolic ordination and was able to head home. No political oaths required. Now back to Freeman. If Freeman could get Seabury to ordain him, then Freeman could also bypass the whole political oaths problem. In 1786, Freeman writes to Seabury. Freeman tells him that despite his unorthodox views, he wants to be an Episcopal minister. Seabury says okay, and invites Freeman to Connecticut to discuss it further. Well, about 30 seconds into their conversation, Freeman says that he cannot conscientiously recite the prayers to the Son and Holy Spirit because he doesn't believe in the Trinity. Seabury then calls Freeman an incorrigible heretic, tell us how you really feel, and instructs Freeman to come back once he's changed his opinions. Freeman doesn't go back. But just a little later, in 1786, Freeman's prospects get much brighter. Parliament passes a new law that year called the Consecration of Bishops Abroad Act. This law lets the Archbishop ordain American clergy without requiring any political oaths. So the dilemma that American Episcopalians found themselves in after the war is resolved. And it didn't even take that long. One of the first American ministers to be ordained in London was Samuel Provost. Provost was the perfect person to ordain James Freeman. He had supported the Revolutionary War from the outset. At the Episcopal conventions in Philadelphia, the one I briefly touched on earlier, Provost had even advocated for liberal reforms to the American Episcopal liturgy. So Freeman writes to Provost and tells him the same thing he told Seabury, that yes, he's a little unorthodox, but rest assured, he's a devout Episcopalian and he wants to remain as such. No dice. Provost mulls it over for a bit, but eventually decides that the issue of whether to ordain Freeman is of such importance, he cannot decide it alone. He'll bring it up to the Convention of Delegates the next time they meet in Philadelphia. The year now is 1787. The delegates aren't scheduled to meet until 1789. Freeman is done waiting. So just a few weeks later, the congregation drafts up a plan to ordain Freeman in the Episcopal tradition, but without a bishop. That's right, a bishop will not ordain Freeman. The power to confer ordination will come from the consent of the congregation alone. I'm going to turn in a second to the ordination of James Freeman. This is the most important part of our story today. But first, why exactly did the conservative Seabury and the liberal provost both refuse to ordain Freeman? It's easy enough to see why Seabury might not have been fond of Freeman. A religious conservative, Seabury thought that Freeman's views simply were too radical. But why then would Provost, someone whose track record showed him to be liberal and a bit heterodox himself, why would he also decline Freeman's request? The reason, again, has to do with this central disagreement about the relationship between American Episcopalians and the English Church. Freeman believed that the Revolutionary War had given him liberty from the Church of England to do anything, to revise the liturgy, to dispense with bishops in an ordination ceremony. But Provost was less sure. As a delegate to the Philadelphia Conventions, Provost was in the camp of American Episcopalians that believed it was still part of the English Church. And on the issue of anti-Trinitarianism, the position of the Church of England was clear. Anti-Trinitarian ministers need not apply. It's back to the ordination ceremony. The ceremony itself was written down, fortunately. You can still see it for yourself at the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is an impressive historical document. It spans religious history from St. Paul in Jerusalem to St. Ambrose in 4th century Milan to the clergymen and dissenters of the English Enlightenment. But where it gets really interesting, I think, is when into this rich history enters a discussion about American law. The congregation used its interpretation of American citizenship to support its decision to ordain Freeman without a bishop. In America, they wrote, corporate societies enjoyed the responsibility of, quote, making rules and orders for their own regulation, so long as these rules were not, quote, repugnant to the general laws of the legislature of the state under which they are formed. And because the chapel considered itself one such corporate society, and they knew of no legislation that specifically, quote, forbade any congregation of Christians from ordaining a minister in what way they please, it followed that King's Chapel had lawful authority to ordain the warden's and vestry. The congregation then turned to address the debate among American Episcopalians more directly. The goal here was to resolve the question about who had sovereignty to make religious law in the American Episcopal Church. Where am I? Excuse me. Did the power reside with the Archbishop in London, as some believe, or did it reside somewhere else? In England, as we know, Parliament controlled the Episcopal Church. As a result, the congregation argued, lawful authority in the Episcopal Church, what we might call sovereignty, could be found in the king and Parliament. But notably, they said, sovereignty did not come from, quote, bishops, priests, or in other words, ecclesiastical authority. And in fact, the congregation even cited to a few cases in British history in which Parliament actually overrode the will of Anglican bishops. So in America, under a civil authority that declined to make Episcopal church law, the congregation concluded the true successors of the king and Parliament would not be ecclesiastical authority. It wouldn't be the bishops. The true successors would be, quote, the people. We're going to come back to this in a moment, but for right now, I want to finish up our story. There was a backlash against Freeman's ordination. A few of Freeman's own congregants dissented, and Boston's Episcopal establishment was quick to follow suit. Their denunciation was swift, harsh, and very public. In a newspaper article, several prominent Episcopal ministers publicly excommunicated Freeman and his congregation from the Episcopal faith. This left the chapel in a state of limbo. According to Boston's Episcopalians, King's Chapel was not Episcopal. Yet as the congregation had made clear throughout the ordination ceremony, they considered their ordination of Freeman a temporary but lawful arrangement only until proper ordination could be conferred. So when did King's Chapel become a Unitarian chapel? It's hard to say. There's no single record, unfortunately, that makes it easy to pinpoint. But I think I've found a good answer. The precipitating event was, of all things, an Episcopal ordination. The candidate to the ministry was William Montague of Christ Church in Boston, and the ordaining bishop was none other than Samuel Seabury himself. Some of the congregants of King's Chapel decided to attend this event, and when they did, they were horrified by what they saw. The pomp, the seriousness, the superstition of the ceremony. There was one part in which Seabury breathed upon the candidate in order to confer his power. The few congregants who had still wanted Freeman to be ordained in this way now asked Freeman if he would ever actually undergo such an ordeal. And Freeman said he wouldn't. This I consider to be the moment at which King's Chapel becomes a Unitarian chapel. This was in 1788. By then, three things had come together. One, congregation adopted an anti-Trinitarian liturgy. Two, the chapel has been excommunicated by other American Episcopalians. Three, the congregants now themselves had let go of their desire to one day see Freeman ordained by an Episcopal bishop. At this point, I think we call King's Chapel a Unitarian chapel, the first of its kind in the United States of America. We've covered a lot of ground here today. We started with Henry Caine in Boston. We went back to Samuel Clarke and to Theophilus Lindsay in England, and then we came back to Boston to find James Freeman. What do we make of all of this? What I want you to take away from this talk is that more was at stake for James Freeman in the 1780s than just the doctrine of the Trinity. In the unique context of the early American Republic, Freeman was not just fighting for his own conception of a Christian religious doctrine. He was also fighting for a certain conception of American citizenship. Freeman believed that American citizens were politically sovereign and religiously sovereign. He believed that the laws of the newly independent United States, based on what they said and did not say, granted those living under it total religious freedom. In the decades prior to 1787, there had been real movement towards this conclusion. Several colonial legislatures had expanded religious liberties and abolished religious tests and other forms of discrimination. John Adams's Massachusetts Constitution, written in 1779, granted each person the liberty to worship God in the manner most agreeable to the dictates of his conscience. In 1786, in Virginia, a bill drafted by Thomas Jefferson granting Virginians of all faiths freedom to worship and equal protection under the law is ratified. A year before, when the Virginia legislature proposed a bill that would levy a religious tax, James Madison circulates a petition against it and declares that the free exercise of religion is an unalienable right. In September 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates declined to recognize a national church. And finally, in 1790, George Washington tells a congregation of Jews at a synagogue in Rhode Island that the United States would give no sanction to bigotry. Everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid, he quotes. So now we see why Freeman's ordination is so important. Here is a private citizen embodying a conception of American citizenship held by the political giants of the age, the founders, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, George Washington. Remember, the idea of religious freedom was not yet universally the law of the land. The First Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees, among other things, religious liberty, was not ratified until 1791, 4 years after Freeman's ordination. Back then, it was still just an idea, but it was becoming an idea central to what it meant to be an American citizen. Freeman internalizes this and he puts it into practice. He's not a politician giving floor speeches or proposing bills. He's a private citizen demonstrating through his actions that religious sovereignty resides in the people. That religious sovereignty resides in a framework of American citizenship. It was the founders who enshrined into law the principle that the people are politically sovereign. But it was people like James Freeman who proved through deeds, not words, that American citizens were religiously sovereign too. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer some questions if you have.
How'd you get interested in James Freeman?
My second semester, junior year of college, I wanted to write a thesis about Anglicanism in America because I thought it was fascinating. You know, what happened to all the Anglicans? You're an Anglican and you wake up one day and things are pretty different. So what happened to them? And I knew that a lot of them stayed. So it's like, you know, how do you reconcile something as massive as that? And I started studying Anglicans, and I started looking at Boston Anglicans, and I saw that, you know, there were 4 main churches in Boston at the time, and they became Episcopal, okay. But there was one outlier. There was one church that didn't just become Episcopal, it chose this new path. And that became the sort of kernel, is how did King's Chapel, in this moment of identity changing, you know, how did they take this third path? Not Anglican, not Episcopalian, but Unitarian. Where does that come from? Yes?
I think you said that Freeman read read some of Isaac Newton's work.
Yes.
So Newton also was anti-Trinitarian.
Yes, so Newton would have been anti-Trinitarian, but a lot of the, some of the English anti-Trinitarians were a little bit less radical than Freeman and Theophilus Lindsey. They believed that Christ was not divine, that he was human. Newton was probably somewhere on the Arian track. This is the idea that God is one being, but Christ is divine, but of a subordinate divinity. But yes, Newton, I think, was, and he was an Anglican too. You know, it's important to remember, like Samuel Clarke. There was a lot of dissent in the national church around this time.
And the other big influence on British anti-Trinitarians was the English Presbyterians, not the Scottish Presbyterians, and especially Joseph Priestley. To what extent do you think Freeman was reading Priestley and influenced by him?
Well, I mean, he certainly was, because Freeman knew about all these English guys. And in fact, my college thesis, the thrust of the thesis was that Freeman descends from an English anti-Trinitarian tradition. You know, there's a dispute in the historiography, where does American Unitarianism come from? And a lot of historians today, I still think it's actually the dominant argument. They say that it comes from the Congregationalist ministers of, the mid 18th century. Charles Chauncey especially. It comes from these ministers who focused on, these American ministers, who focused on the benevolence of God and reason and rationality in their preaching. That's where it comes from. And my thesis was arguing that that kind of theology becomes 19th century American Unitarianism. William Ellery Channing, he adopts a lot of what Chauncey had to say about religion. But what I argued was that if we want to look at the origins, we have to look at where it first happens. And it doesn't happen with Channing in the 19th century. Unitarianism starts right here in Boston with James Freeman in the 1780s. And Freeman, there's just no doubt about it that he's influenced by the English anti-Trinitarians. He's reading Samuel Clarke at Harvard. He's corresponding with some of these guys. He meets William Hazlitt Sr., who, according to one account, is the one who brings him Lindsey's prayer book. So, and also I'll just say that in a letter to his father, James Freeman says that his revised prayer book is based upon the work of the English anti-Trinitarians. So I can't speak to Priestley directly. I didn't look into Priestley as much as I did Clarke and Lindsey, but there's no doubt that Freeman was based in the English tradition. So I'm sure Priestley had an enormous effect.
One last question. Sorry if I missed this, but what was the year of the ordination at Christ Church that the
That was 1788.
88.
I'm 98% sure of that.
1780.
In Christ Church, that's what we call today Old North Church.
I get these mixed up. I'll have to check that as well. I don't want to give you an answer.
It's
Okay.
Church.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Sam.